Hey everyone, I'm Hoki Hoshi, and today let's talk about drag racing. Now we're going to start this video by talking about mods and car selection, and then we'll get into tuning and some driving tips. Drag racing is built off an entirely different rule set from the other racing disciplines like rally or street, so let's start by looking at what's important in a drag car. The car we're going to be looking at today is the Chevy Nova Forza Edition, which out of the box is already a pretty good drag build. So the first thing you want to be looking for in your build is the power to weight ratio. You can find this value by taking the weight of your vehicle and dividing it by its power. Now keep in mind I'm in the US and your units might be different, but it still works as a valid reference point to compare against other cars. So you can see that for this vehicle my weight is 2,791 pounds and I'm going to be dividing that by 1,261 for the horsepower. This gives me a result of about 2.2, which means that for every 2.2 pounds my car weighs, I get 1 horsepower. This is also where the Koenigsegg 1-to-1 gets its name. It has 1 horsepower for every kilogram that it weighs. Now, while we're here, let's take a look at this dyno graph. Now, if you've already watched my gearing video, you should have a basic understanding of what this graph shows you, but let's take a look at it again because gearing is one of the most important aspects of drag racing. You can see here that the horsepower, which is represented in orange, peaks at just over 6,000. Now for drag racing, we never want our gearing to shift too far below that peak point, and it's helpful that it doesn't drop off sharply after that either. So keep that in mind when you're trying to tune the gearing on your own car, and try to find a car with a power band that stays near its peak for a longer period of time. Now, going back to the power to weight ratio, when you're doing modifications to your car, always keep that in mind. There are some modifications that will add power but also add a lot of weight, and there are other modifications like brakes that you wouldn't think you need in drag, but they do reduce the weight of the car. It can sometimes be helpful to keep a calculator around so that you can do the math and see if your weight ratio is going up, which is bad, or down, which is of course better. Another thing to keep in mind is that even though it doesn't contribute to your power to weight ratio, better shift times lead to better drag times. It's almost always worth it to sacrifice a little bit of horsepower to get better shift times, and you might want the race diff and the race transmission as well to get those tuning options unlocked. For tires, the obvious choice is drag tires, but if those aren't available, go with race. And if your vehicle is rear-wheel drive, pick the thinnest possible front tires and widest possible rear. But if it's all-wheel drive, go with the widest tires all the way around. Now for aero, I generally recommend going with whatever is the lightest. For drag racing, since it doesn't involve very high speeds or high-speed cornering, you're not going to get a lot of benefits from the aero downforce, so again, just go with whatever is the lightest or whatever you think looks best. So that's a basic overview of what you should look for in modifying your cars, but of course the real fun comes in the tuning, so let's talk about it. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, drag involves an entirely different rule set for tuning than most of the other racing disciplines, so take what you know about tuning and basically just throw it out the window for drag racing. Unlike tuning with the other racing disciplines, which involves a lot of fine tuning and delicate balance between too much or too little of a setting, drag tuning involves a lot of extremes, and the tires are no exception. You want to set your tire pressure as low as possible to whatever wheels are getting power, and generally as high as possible to whatever wheels aren't. This means that on a rear-wheel drive vehicle, set your rear wheels to minimum pressure and your front to maximum, but on an all-wheel drive vehicle, set them all to minimum. Although this can sacrifice higher end speed and acceleration, it's generally best to have the best launch possible and sacrifice a little bit out of the top end than it is the other way around. If you do notice though that the car is burning out through higher gears or just in general suffering through the higher end, you can turn up the pressure a bit. Now for the gearing, which like I've mentioned before is essentially the most important aspect of your drag build. So we're going to actually save this until we've got the rest of the car built properly, and then we'll come back to it at the end. So for alignment, we're again tuning for maximum straight line grip, and this might be one of the only situations where positive camber is beneficial. Your front camber setting doesn't play a big role in drag times, but I would recommend keeping it on the negative side if anything, and don't go to the extremes here. Keep it between 0 and -1. The rear camber setting is where things get a bit more interesting. As your suspension compresses, negative camber generally increases, and for straight line driving, when you're either launching or under hard acceleration, negative camber is bad because it decreases your contact patch with the road. This is where adding in some positive camber can be really helpful for counteracting the negative camber you get when your suspension compresses. I recommend opening up your telemetry window and ensuring that your camber remains around 0 during launch and under full acceleration. Now with camber out of the way, let's talk about toe. I recommend never really having any front toe as it doesn't play much of a role in drag racing, but having a small amount of rear toe in can sometimes help keep your launches more stable and straight. I still recommend keeping this at 0 to start with, but if you're having trouble keeping the car straight during launches, you can add back that small amount of toe in. Now caster is another setting that doesn't really play much of a role in drag racing, but if anything, I would recommend maxing this out as it will help a small amount with stability. Anti-roll bars are another setting that doesn't really play a large role in drag racing, but having a soft setting can help a bit with launch grip, and having a stiff setting can help a bit with launch stability. Now for springs, we're going back to the extremes. Start by setting both your front and rear suspension as low as possible. This allows the rear suspension to squat and absorb some of your power, giving you higher grip during launch, and it means that your front suspension won't be darting all over the place and will be more stable and consistent during the drag run. It's definitely possible that your rear suspension setting will need to be adjusted, but we'll talk about that later. Your front ride height comes more down to personal preference than it does actual performance. I recommend it to be lower, but a lot of people recommend it higher. By adjusting this setting, you're changing how the car squats and how the suspension compresses during launch, so find what setting best suits you. Your rear setting, however, plays a much bigger role in the car's performance. I've been talking a bit about the squat during launch, and this is really where it all comes down to. You need to have a good bit of suspension travel and a soft enough suspension setting so that your car can absorb the extra horsepower instead of just spinning it through the tires. This allows you to get a much grippier launch. We might need to adjust this setting as well later, but again, we'll get back to that. Let's talk about damping. Your damping settings don't play a huge role in a drag setup, but playing with the rebound stiffness can adjust how much your suspension pushes back during that launch squat. Keep the bump stiffness soft so that your car doesn't skirt over any bumps and it just absorbs them through the suspension. Downforce tuning, like I said earlier, doesn't really play much of a role in the common drag setup, but if you have the tuning option unlocked, keep it towards speed. Now, brake tuning can actually be one of the most overlooked settings for increasing your drag times. No, of course I'm kidding. You can skip over this one for the tuning window. If you're braking during a drag run, something has gone horribly wrong. Now, finally for the differential. Your acceleration setting should be at 100% to ensure that equal torque is applied to both the left and right wheels. Your deceleration settings shouldn't really make a difference because you should never be decelerating during a drag race, but for the sake of stability, keep it towards 100%. And that just about does it for setting your base tune. Let's get out onto the drag strip and tune our gearing and adjust our rear suspension settings if we need to. I strongly recommend testing your tunes at an actual race versus in the open world. This reduces a lot of the variables and gives you a consistent and easily repeatable testing ground. So just after doing this first run, our tune is already well outperforming the stock tune, and there's more to go from here. Let's first talk about the gearing. We're going to slow things down and dissect the run. Now, you never want to shift towards the end of your drag race, and this car was shifting into 5th in just about the last second or so. What I'm going to do is adjust the final drive to make my gears longer. This is going to mean instead of shifting into 5th, I should be at the top of 4th towards the end of my run. The next gear we're going to look at is 1st. Pay attention to my tack on the right, and you can see that my revs bounce consistently a few times, and then they go up slower before I shift into 2nd. That slower rise in revs is an indicator that my wheels have gained traction, but I want them to gain traction at a slightly lower rev point so that I'm closer to my peak horsepower, not spinning my wheels quite as much, and have a more clear indicator of when I should shift. This is going to mean that I make my first gear a good bit longer. Now 2nd and 3rd gears are a little bit easier here. I want to make sure that as I shift up in gears, my revs never drop too far below my peak horsepower. And as I go up in gears, I want to start at a higher rev range. This is going to mean shortening my 2nd and 3rd gears, but keep in mind that I want to get close to, but not max out 4th gear by the end of my run. Now let's take a look at a run with these gearing adjustments made. With this run, you'll be able to see that my launch is a lot faster and my shifting indication is a little bit smoother, and by the end of my run, I'm just at the top of 4th, but I'll never shift into 5th. So that's just what we're looking for, and we've been rewarded by a much faster time. Just remember that tuning still takes a ton of trial and error. You'll need to make some small adjustments and rerun the course over and over, but as long as you keep what I've said in mind, you should have some success. Now for the last part of our video, I said I'd go back to the suspension settings, so we're going to open the telemetry and take a look at how our suspension reacts during our launch. So with our suspension telemetry open, we can see that during launch our front suspension droops completely and our rear actually decompresses a little bit as well, and this brings us to an interesting point. In the real world drag scene, there's a lot of debate over whether or not squat is even a good thing, and it's generally agreed that, especially on higher end, more serious drag cars, it's best to not have squat, and they're built to anti-squat and can preload their suspension and get a better launch. This is what the Nova's doing. Luckily for us in Forza, a lot of these settings seem to be baked into the car by default, and we don't need to worry about whether or not a car is designed to squat or anti-squat. Interestingly enough, and this is not like real life, a softer suspension setting will benefit both squat and anti-squat setups in Forza. So if you notice your suspension lifting during drag racing, don't worry about it and keep your suspension soft. But if you're driving a car that squats, open up your telemetry and make sure that you're not bottoming out your rear suspension. This is one of the few cases where you'd want to increase your rear suspension settings. You can do this by lowering the car, but I wouldn't recommend it. Try playing with suspension stiffness as well as rebound stiffness. Now the other setting we can use telemetry for is our camber setting. If you'll remember, we added a little bit of positive camber to counteract the negative camber that usually comes from squatting, but this car doesn't squat. So what we need to do is take a look at our camber during a launch and see where it sits. As it turns out, this car still does benefit from a small amount of positive camber during launch. And with that, you should know just about everything you need to get a start with drag racing. As usual, the comment section is a great place to both share and learn new knowledge. I love having conversations with people about this kind of stuff and learning new things myself, so I hope that that knowledge can pass on to you guys as well. As always, thank you so much for watching. We're just about to hit the 10,000 subscribers mark, which is insane to me. Thank you again. I've got plenty more on the way, so stick around. And guys, keep enjoying Forza Horizon 4. The new expansion is just around the corner. Plenty of content on that. I cannot wait. Thanks, guys.